All right. Welcome everyone to Herring Gut Coastal Science Center's May Learn, Discover, Grow series. My name is Elena Zahowski and I'm an aquatic science educator at Herring Gut Coastal Science Center. And today, Tom Mullen, our executive director, joins us along with Sally Crusan behind the Herring Gut logo and Miss Carrie-Ann Grinnell, Mrs. Grinnell. She is one of the aquatic science educators also. And because our time this evening is spent talking about the amazing natural resources that Maine has to offer us, I want to begin our time together with an acknowledgement honoring all Indigenous people. We wish to acknowledge the spiritual and physical connection the Abenaki and Wabanaki peoples have maintained to the Aki land and Nebi water. Herring Gut Coastal Science Center and our work exists within this Aki land and Nebi water of this unceded territory of the Wabanaki homeland. It is our responsibility to foster relationships and opportunities that strengthen the well-being of the Indigenous people who carry forward the traditions of their ancestors. We love to offer these virtual events in a collaborative way. Because of this, we ask that everyone make sure that their microphone is on mute to reduce competing voices and noise. At the end of the presentation, we will have some time to ask questions. You can also type questions into the chat box and we'll compile them until the end. Lastly, I wish to note that Herring Gut Coastal Science Center is a nonprofit organization supported by donations and gifts from the public. Through your generosity, we are able to provide programs like the one we are bringing you tonight. If you like the event tonight, and if you have the means, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can find a donation link on our website, as well as in the chat at the end of the presentation. Our plan for tonight is to talk to hardworking folks in the shellfish industry and to highlight the partnerships between farmers and scientists. I would like to now introduce our guest speakers. They will introduce themselves further when we get to their portions. We have Madison Mayer from Hurricane Island for Center in Leadership, Jordan Kramer from Winnegance Oyster Farm, Jessie Batchelder from Manomet, and Mike Gaffney from Eros Oyster. And our first segment is with Madison and Jordan. So Madison and Jordan, take it away.
Thank you. I think Jordan is going to share our presentation. Thank you so much. Looks great. Thanks, Jordan. So my name is Madison, and I am the aquaculture manager at Hurricane Island. So I help run our farm, and because we are a research arm, I also help run our research. So I'm really excited to tell you guys a little bit more about our organization and the project that we are working with Jordan. And we're really excited for this collaboration this year. Jordan, you mind going to the next slide? Thank you. So just a little background around Hurricane. We are a small island located about 12 miles offshore. And this is a seasonal island campus. So we're out here from April through November, and for the rest of the year, we are based out of Rockland, Maine, and work out of Rockland with local schools and local scientists. And we are also a 501c nonprofit, and I've included our sort of mission on this slide, and it's science education, applied research, and leadership development. And Jordan, if you can go to the next slide. Great, thank you. So one of the really big things that we do on Hurricane Island is use hands-on experimental learning and the scientific process with all of the programs that come on our island. And we sort of use this as a framework for a sort of modern day lens of leadership. And so we work with a lot of school groups that will come out in the spring and the fall, in addition to our own programs that we run in the summer. And so we help students sort of engage with the world around them and see themselves as change makers and participants in finding solutions to the challenges that we're facing, both sort of on a global level and sort of on a personal level as well. And we also work with students to engage in our scientific research that is happening on hurricane. So the top photo, center photo, is a group of students helping us sort through a spat bag and collect baby scallops that will then grow up on our farm. The far right students is a group of students that grew their own kelp line and harvest it. Students will conduct their own research in the intertidal zone, for example. We have a group using a quadrat, and then on the leftmost, that's a student that we're working with in a local school with a 3D printer. And so that is really exciting for us because it's new and it's sort of what we're doing with Jordan. Jordan, you mind going to our next slide? Thank you. And so for our research on hurricane, our research agenda sort of focuses on answering local high priority questions and increasing scientific capacity regionally through collaboration. So we have a 3.2 acre aquaculture lease site on the north end of our island, and we are permitted to grow scallops, kelp, oysters, and mussels on that farm. And our really big focus, as you can probably see from all these photos, is scallops right now. Some of the projects that we are doing are other collaborations. So for example, that bottom left photo of the scallops in a white bin with those orange tags on them is a project that we did with the Department of Marine Resources, where we tagged wild scallops, released them, and then some were caught this past winter. And we were able to track how much they grew, how far they've moved. So that was a really exciting thing for us. We have some dive photos in the middle. So we conduct transects monitoring wild populations of scallops. And to kind of understand the rotational management effects of the scallop fishery in our area. And one of the largest projects that we work on is sort of understanding the reproductive cycles and phases and timing of scallops, both in aquaculture populations and in wild populations. And we do that through dissections. So weekly, we'll get a huge sample of scallops, dissect them, and then weigh their reproductive organ or their gonad, which you can see is sort of the red or the white kidney bean shaped organ in those photos, and we'll compare it to the rest of their soft tissue weight. We'll see it get really heavy and then really light, so we'll know that they have released their eggs and sperm. And this year, we're really, really excited to kind of be really adding oysters to our farm. We've worked with some small collaborations in the past, but this is definitely diving into oysters on a much larger scale for us. And we're really excited to have Jordan's expertise in helping us make that work on our farm. We're really excited to sort of be able to act as another set of hands for him. So I'm going to pass this over to Jordan now to tell you a little bit about his farm and the project that we're working on together.
So my name is Jordan Kramer, and I run Winnegance Oyster Farm. I've been farming for 8 years now. It's a small oyster farm in the New Meadows River in Mid-Coast, Maine, located in West Bath. You can see just a small portion of my farm in that photo. I grow typically in floating cages, which we'll see a little bit more of later. And on my small farm with 66 of these cages, I can grow around 70,000 oysters a year. So just to show you the location of the farm, the pink dots in the center in West Bath is where I'm located. So starting in 2017, I began doing citizen science research on my farm. And my first project was designing oyster gear that used the movement of the tides to try to automate some of the more labor-intensive and energy-intensive tasks on the farm, which would mostly be cleaning cages that are fouled with invertebrates or algae. So you can see here 3 different designs, 2 of which are experimental. One is just a take on a floating bag, which is a sort of common oyster growing equipment. So these round ones spun slowly with wave action. And these ones with the float in the center were designed to tip as the tide moved, but really didn't work so well. But it really sort of began my interest in designing custom gear that met my needs more so than the just small handful of types of equipment that were available on the market commercially. One of my next projects was using crop shading to sort of eliminate this same sort of fouling problem. So you can see on the left a cage that was left untreated in the fall, where we get a very, very large red algae and green vulva algae bloom in the early fall, where air drying doesn't do a great job to clean the cages. So trying to figure out different ways to prevent algal fouling on the farm. So I used opaque sheets that sort of hovered over the central section of these cages to shade out any algae growth. And this worked quite well. Another project that I worked on over a number of years, both on my own and with Manomet, is growing quahog clams and polyculture with oysters. So in this footprint of my farm, having another second long line that sits in the mud below, and using that space to grow an additional crop in the same lease footprint and with different nutritional needs. So it's been a journey for this one, but it's certainly been interesting, and you'll hear much more about that from Jessie and Mike. Last year, I used different types of commercially available oyster gear and different techniques to see the effect on the shape of oysters in an attempt to do some crop differentiation. So hoping that different types of growth treatments would give distinctly different oysters, which actually turned out to be the case, sort of surprisingly, for these oyster bags straddled on top of cages were much, much different than all the other types of crops I grew. And then now, this year, I'm very excited to be working on going back to gear design and thinking about, well, if I want to make custom gear, we have different sorts of tools where you don't have to send a design to a factory to get something custom made. Whether the idea is that we could, by testing materials that are able to be 3D printed, allow farmers to design their own gear, kind of democratizing gear design. So you're not just dependent on the 2 or 3 types of gear that are available in the state. So what this project intends to do to sort of decouple what these new wild designs, what their weaknesses would be, is to actually just recreate a standard ubiquitous piece of oyster farming equipment, which is the oyster bag. The oyster bag is not what you think of necessarily as a bag. It's rigid. It's more like a mesh box, and it's used in basically every oyster farming operation in the entire state of Maine, and is one of the most common pieces of equipment up and down the East Coast. These are made out of high-density polyethylene. They're about, let's see, they're about 3 inches deep and just shy of 40 inches long. And so by the end of the growth cycle, you can probably have about 300 full-size oysters in there with all growing happily. And so part of the reason why we're recreating this is we're going to see, since these are so ubiquitously used, we know what the weak points are, where they fail, how long they last. And so if we're creating new gear eventually, we want to know that why it breaks is because of the design and not because of the material. So here's another look at 2 different ways oyster bags are used. So on the left, we have what we call a floating bag. This is floating on my driveway because they don't actually use these on the farm, but it's one of those rigid mesh boxes with foam or buoys on the side to keep it at the surface. On the right is a picture from my farm, And those are oyster bags in an oyster cage. So this is very similar to, say, a lobster trap on pontoons. And we're looking in this project to recreate these bags out of different materials that can be 3D printed and see how they wear, how they work out in the field. So you can see just by looking at these two designs, they might have very different stresses. The bags in the cage could chafe, they could rub up against the side, they could erode. And I think that's likely going to be how those either wear or fail, where the bag on the left could bend because there's no additional support, or there's just more stresses on it, particularly where the zip ties hold the pontoons to the bag. And we're early on the stages of this project. We've had a couple schools, St. George School and I believe Camden, working on this. And we've had some false starts as well. So we originally started out with what you'd consider to be normal 3D printing, which is extrusion. Think of like frosting coming out of the pastry bag. And so we started out that way, and it was pretty quick that both our cooperators at Hurricane Island and Haystack Mountain School of Crafts, that this was just going to be too slow and it was not going to stick together well enough. So we've pivoted to a different type of automated making, which would be laser cutting. So we're laser cutting small portions of rigid plastic to make meshes. And we are also doing what's called CNC routing, which is a robotic router kind of drill that will cut solid sheets of plastic. So that's sort of where we're headed. And we've gone through we've eliminated now 3 or 4 different types of plastic, and I think we're zeroing in on a few different things that might work better for the machinery. So we're eager to get these out in the field, which should probably happen in the next 3 weeks. So unfortunately, we don't have any results yet, but just very, very excited that we have stuff being fabricated as we speak, and that we'll see how it starts working in not too long. And then just as I mentioned, when looking at the cages, we're looking at different ways these could fail. So whether it be whether they erode, whether they crack, whether plastic stretches, thinking like, cheese on the pizza, whether it gets thin as it from strain and weight, discoloration, which could be from UV damage or water damage, and then we just have a category for outright failure. Additionally, just thinking about some of the earlier projects, I've certainly noticed over the years that different materials pick up fouling in different amounts and different types of fouling. So we're also going to look at the types of plants or algae and animals that colonize these over the course of the season to see if material makes a big difference in terms of how foul these get. And then we're going to deploy these on 2 very, very different farms. As you can see from the map, I am way up a watershed in a very protected area with lots and lots of tidal flow, where Hurricane Island is way out in the bay, much more weather, but not as much directional flow. And having not seen the site, Madison could certainly explain it much better than I. So that's where I'll leave off for now until we have some questions.
Well, thank you very much, Maddie and Jordan. I learned new things, and I have a couple questions for later on too. Our next partnership will be Jessie and Mike. So Jessie and Mike, take it away.
Mike, do you want to start us off? I think you're on mute.
All right. Good evening. Mike Gaffney here. Along with my wife and son, I'm the owner of Eros Oyster, which is a medium-sized oyster farm in Robin Hood Cove in Georgetown. I say medium-sized. We are producing annually about 400,000 oysters now. This is our 5th year. So it takes an oyster farm quite a bit of time, at least in northern waters, to get up to equilibrium. And by that, I mean that the number of oyster seed we buy is equivalent to the number of oysters that we sell. We're not there yet. We've got a couple more years to go. And I expect we're always going to be primarily an oyster farm. That'll be our cash crop, but we do want to diversify for a number of reasons. One is farming ashore or at sea is a risky business and you could have catastrophic loss. So we'd like to have a secondary crop, at least one crop that might carry us over through a bad year. And we considered mussels, but my neighboring oyster farms nixed that idea because mussels are our mortal enemy of the oyster farmer. Mussel set, mussel spat, they get in the bags and they use those byssal threads to clump the oysters together. They can't filter and they die. So my neighbors were not keen on me actually introducing more mussels to the cove. So we thought we try hard clams, and there's been, Jessie will explain, there's a history of trying to farm hard clams in Maine that hasn't gone so well. There are a number of difficulties. We've been working with Manomet and Jessie for a couple of years now with limited success. We think we've learned from mistakes what not to do, and we think what we need to do, in addition to starting them on upwellers rather than through passive nursery trays, is to use the intertidal. We think they need more sediment. We've been trying to grow them like an oyster, and it works, but they're slow, they're small. So we're going to try to use the intertidal. So our concern as an oyster farm is we want diversification. We think hard clam is the way to go. Our restaurants, our customers love our oysters, and they're always saying, what else you got? And I have to respond, I got nothing. It's all oysters. So we want to have something else to offer them. And I think it'd be all, we happen to have on our farm 2,000 feet of intertidal that it's not being used at all. And we'd like to make use of that. And so we're going to try to grow the hard clams in oyster bags buried in the sediment in the intertidal. And I'll let Jessie explain how that's going to work. So nice to be with you.
Great. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Is that coming through for everyone?
Yep.
Perfect. Jessie Batchelder, nice to be here tonight. And I work for Manomet, which is a conservation science organization. And I'm part of our fisheries division. And our fisheries team is based out of Brunswick, and our work focuses throughout the Gulf of Maine. And we work to promote resilient and productive coastal ecosystems and communities through applied science and engaging with community. And our work generally falls into 4 different categories: research and monitoring, restoration, management, and then the one that's most applicable here tonight is fisheries diversification. And Mike mentioned this, how for a farmer and for a fisher to be fully reliant on one species, whether it's oysters or lobster, it definitely presents some risk. And so we are working to increase fisheries diversification and really believe that that leads to more resilient communities, which is really where we want to focus most of our work of who it's impacting and where it's impacting. So a lot of our fisheries diversification work has been in new and emerging markets for species that maybe aren't historically found in the Gulf of Maine, but we're starting to see more, such as black sea bass and, like we've talked about a little bit, quahogs. And also in creating new markets for species that we don't typically think of being commercially viable, such as the invasive green crab. And like the for the quahog aquaculture is kind of new in Maine, and we're seeing it both pop up more in the aquaculture sense and also in the wild fisheries, where there's a lot of communities that their diggers are starting to shift from soft shell clam to more quahog digging because of these changes in population. And this work really, a lot of this started with Jordan. It's great that he's here tonight as well. And some of what he started doing on his farm back in 2017, and Manomet then became involved with Jordan and since expanded that work to other farms in the area. So we worked to take this idea of growing oysters and quahogs together in different areas of the water column, oysters primarily growing on the surface, and then using the bottom of, trying to move my slides forward, let's see. Oh, there we are. Yeah, so this diagram shows how we were growing the quahogs. So the oysters are growing on the surface, and then these farmers have all of this territory underneath on their lease that could be utilized for other species. And so the quahogs were grown, the idea being that they could grow successfully on the bottom, and to compare whether that worked, we grew some on the surface and some on the bottom as well. And we found that they grew, and we had two farms, Jordan's farm in the New Meadows, along with Lincoln Smith, Longreach Oyster in the New Meadows, and then Eros with Mike Gaffney and Chad Campbell that are both in Georgetown and Robin Hood Cove. And we saw different growth rates between the different farms, and in some farms, the surface and bottom grown quahogs were more similar, and in others, in Robin Hood Cove, there is a much wider difference between the growth we saw on the ones grown on the surface and the ones grown on the bottom. And it also took longer than maybe we were hoping. And so it didn't, while they did grow, it wasn't necessarily a fast way to get a species to market, and took a lot of time. And so from this work, we found that the quahogs did grow, like I said, and that there was a market for them. And that market existed right in this kind of smaller shell. And it's a smaller shell size that can be legally harvested from the wild fishery. And so chefs were excited about it. Customers were excited about it. And then it's the challenge of bringing that product to the market. And so our next step, I guess that's my slides there. Our next step is thinking, okay, are the bottom grown quahogs and surface grown quahogs weren't necessarily the best way to bring them to the market. So what other options are out there? And like Mike said, intertidal culture kind of came to the table. And typically in the other parts of the US, a lot of quahog farming is done along the Atlantic coast, and it's all done in the intertidal area. And in Maine, we have a few different issues that they don't face in Florida or in the Carolinas, and that includes sea ice in the winter. So that's one of the big challenges we're thinking about as we move this project forward, of how do they survive overwintering, because sea ice in different areas can pick up gear and move it from one location to another, and that could cause you to lose your crop. So that's where we're at now, of starting to get this intertidal project going, and Mike mentioned using the upwellers so that we can get a quahog to a larger size a little quicker, and then be able to plant it onto the flat. And Mike, I don't know, do you want to elaborate more on some of the like difficulties from a farmer perspective that you found in some of the past techniques we tried and what you're hoping the intertidal method will make easier for you?
Right. In these experiments, the farmers are sort of the lab rats in the sense that if this is going to work, we have to develop a system that's going to make economic sense. It's going to compete with oyster culture. In other words, farmers were looking for a system to grow cohogs that will return enough value to the farmers that they'll spend some of their labor and capital working on cohogs. So the problem we've experienced thus far is that it just takes, as Jessie indicated, it just takes too long. They grow too slowly, trying to emulate oyster culture. So that's the reason to move into the intertidal. It will hopefully increase the speed at which they grow, but less labor for the oyster farmer. If we can go directly from the upweller, put them in oyster bags or southern bags, which are a bit different, and put them in the sediment in the intertidal and not mess with them much. Hopefully they might even be able to overwinter there. We wouldn't have to take them out and sink them on the lease in the wintertime. Then that labor would be so small that the oyster farmers would be inclined to dedicate some of their capital, that is their gear and their labor, to growing them. So that's really the key, and that's what we're going to be experimenting with Manomet this year, to see if we can grow them year round in the intertidal without sinking them in the subtidal, and even if we do, how much labor will that entail? Back to you, Jessie.
I think that's kind of what I've got from my end, and unless they're happy to open it up to any questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jessie and Mike. And I think it's good to note that both partnerships mentioned the importance of polyculture, of growing more than one type of species in case something happens to one of them, to have as a backup. And regarding partnerships, how else have partnerships helped your business or organization? And any of the presenters are welcome to respond. I can also call on you.
I'm happy to start.
Okay, thanks, Madison.
One of the things that I'm most excited for in this project with Jordan is the ability to involve students. Like I was saying in my slides, a big part of our mission is sort of integrating science education in leadership and applied research. And, you know, it can be hard to do. We have some things that work really well with students, but it's hard to bring a group out to our aquaculture site and put them to work just for numbers and safety. But it's really, really awesome to have a project where students are such an integral part of it. And so that is probably one of the things that I'm most excited for about this. And of course, the sort of, as we mentioned, this is going to be really our first time adding oysters in any significant numbers to our farm. And so just having Jordan's sort of guidance and the best way to set that up has been really invaluable as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing your experience with partnerships. I have another question, and then I'll open it up to questions from anybody else. Do you feel like the Maine aquaculture community is one that could benefit from more collaboration and partnerships? And this is open to any presenter.
From a farmer's perspective, I think it's great to have both the educational aspect that Madison was talking about, but also being able to work with nonprofits to have these real experts help guide research and vet projects and really make sure we're focused in the right way. It helps sort of spur new ideas. I'm always trying to think 1 or 2 projects down the line, and so having all this contact with Hurricane Island and Manomet from prior projects, it's just been really great to have experts to bounce ideas off of. So I think it's great.
Thank you. And did anybody else want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. We have kind of an unusual partnership in Robin Hood Cove in that a resident donated a sum of money to the town to be used to provide microloans to local residents who want to try aquaculture. Oyster farming is fairly capital intensive and there's no return on it for several years, or very little return. It takes oysters quite a while to grow. So this was a huge benefit. It allowed 8 farms to start in the cove. And the deal was there going to be no interest or minimal interest on these loans until the crop starts to come in 3 years down the road, and then they're repaid back to the town, who can then use that to start up additional farms. So it's worked out really well. There would be half as little aquaculture in Robin Hood Cove if it weren't for that. You might call it a partnership between the waterfront owners and the local folks who want to get into aquaculture. And by the way, this experiment that we're doing with Manomet also is another way to get involved with aquaculture if you don't have much capital. If you're going to do intertidal cohog farming, you don't need to have all those cages. You don't need to have a boat and a motor and that sort of thing. So it's a good, it could be a very good entry level into aquaculture. But that microloan partnership has been a huge thing in Georgetown.
That's excellent. So can people with no experience start using that with their new aquaculture, or does it have to be people with some experience?
I'm not sure what the exact criteria are, but I would say no, just based on the 8 farms that started up. They were mostly clammers who have been under pressure because of green crab predation on softshell clams in the area. They had no aquaculture experience, sternmen, folks from all kinds of occupations, none of which were aquaculture. So yeah, no experience required other than demonstrating that you're going to be serious about it.
That's really neat. Sounds successful so far. And I'm going to hold my other questions to see if people from the audience would like to ask our presenters any questions. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask. Okay, I'll ask my next one. What is the best way for the public to support local shellfish farmers?
Well, Jordan and Mike might have a better answer, but from my perspective, I think one of the biggest ones is buy from your local shellfish farmers. Find out which ones are closest to you and develop a relationship with both your farmers and your local clam diggers if you want soft shell clams, and get to know them and learn more about their farm or their work. And they have so much knowledge about the area they're in and the species they're harvesting or growing. And it's a really great way to build community and create a little more buy-in to that eat local mindset. And all your shellfish are both really nutritious for you and environmentally friendly, which is an added bonus. And
to jump in on that, there's another way to support your local farmers. it's there are hurdles to us selling to you. So just in the last few years, on the smallest farms, farmers can no longer sell directly to customers. So contact your state, contact your representatives about allowing sales again off of LPAs would be one way to help the majority of farmers who actually farm on the smallest type of lease.
Another way to assist aquaculture in your area is to show up when the farmer is applying for a lease and they're having public hearings in your community. Show up and offer support can be very helpful in terms of them getting the lease. So I would recommend that.
Thank you for sharing those next steps that we can do to support you all. And that leads into the next question, what Jordan mentioned about farmers not being able to sell directly anymore. From your perspective, how has the industry changed? What other ways has it changed in the last 10 years or 5 years or even the past couple of years?
There's been just such an immense amount of change. And I think, for one, just the number of farmers, and then how well we've gone from, just in my watershed, there being 2 or 3 of us to over 20, which at first seemed like it was going to spur a lot of competition, but the demand has just gone through the roof in the last couple of years too, which is sort of a surprising outcome given how many new farmers there are. It does seem, from my perspective, like there is more push from some of the larger players that have sort of squeezed out, or there's the playing field for large and small farms become more and more uneven in terms of farmers on LPAs not being able to sell directly to customers anymore. The elimination of a license that let the limited wholesale license, which disappeared just before I started, to let small farmers sell directly to restaurants. The elimination of the ability to hire unsupervised staff if you're a small farm. And a lot of this seems to be kind of a growing push towards a neater, tidier kind of industry, but sort of eliminating this ability for self-starters, for owner-operators, for small family farms. And I think we really need to see some sort of push to keep, not even to prioritize small versus large farms, but just to re-level the playing field so small farmers have a chance. And I feel like we've seen in terrestrial farming, over decades, just continuous loss of farming. We've had this small miracle of all these small owner-operated businesses coming up in the state, and we're only a decade into this current wave of new farms. We're already seeing new laws passing that put it all at risk. So I would say just support small farmers on land, support small farmers on the water too, and really be aware of how things are changing.
I need to get a sticker that says that. Support small farmers. So thank you for sharing your perspective on the changes. My next question is a big one. It's talking about climate change being a real threat to shellfish industries across the globe. So with the Gulf of Maine warming faster than other parts of the ocean and acidification increasing, how are you all preparing, teaching, adapting to a changing environment that you all depend on?
I think at Manomet, a lot of our work is, the changes are happening. The Gulf of Maine is warming, and what are new opportunities that we can take from this, and not that they're necessarily going to replace what we have, but starting to see like black sea bass in the wild fishery a lot more of them are starting to show up in this area. Quahogs now being wild harvested in this area. Starting to see a lot more blue crabs come into the northern part of the Gulf of Maine, and not that they're necessarily at a level to be commercially harvested yet, but what are these emerging and shifting species that might be potential here for other communities and people to maybe start to think about targeting. And quahogs in a farming sense here of they like warmer water. And so that maybe wasn't as much of an option historically in the Gulf of Maine and this part of the Gulf of Maine. But as waters are warming, what are some of the other species that we can look to that might grow well or that farmers could think about starting to adapt on their farms as well?
Thank you for sharing, Jessie. Would anybody else like to add to that?
Sure. As someone who farms oysters and clams, it's a funny position to be in because we're sort of at the edge of a natural range for temperature. And so thinking about temperature is not really the threat. It's more seeing the acidification in the hatcheries, or seeing more erratic weather, seeing rainstorms with, last fall I had the 2 biggest rainstorms I've had since I started farming. That came from these, climate-driven storms. These more warmth means more moisture in the atmosphere. I had 7.5 inches in one night last year, just wild. And it killed a bunch of my seed. So figuring out how to adjust with erratic climate, certainly like Jessie said, diversifying my crops, sort of the goal of this project, figuring out ways to diversify gear. So figuring out ways I could put things deeper in the water column that are going to shelter it from, that much fresh water at the surface. It's wild. Figuring out what the new pests are. I mean, with warmer water, oysters and clams will grow faster, but there's new diseases, there's new tunicates, there's new sea vases, there's new all sorts of things that grow on that create new challenges. I typically have 2 waves of tunicate fouling over the course of a season, July and the beginning of September, and it was constant from July through the end of October last 2 years. And that had not happened in the prior 6. And some of these are species I had never seen once before until those 2 years. So it's just, it's climate, but we don't necessarily, it's not just the warmth, it's all these sort of side effects. It's all the new things we have to deal with that, are doing better as the oysters are doing better. So.
Well, thank you, Jordan, for sharing your experiences with that, as well as your solutions in moving forward. Anybody else? Does anyone from the audience have any new questions?
Something that, thing that they try and unstable. I'm just frozen. Can you hear me?
The sound is not very clear on my end. Was that Madison?
Yeah, it was. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Something that we are doing hurricane is and that looks like really necessarily been collected in the areas that we're looking at, potentially Penobscot in general. And we know that things have already changed, but we still think that it's really
Yeah, I think you're frozen again, Madison. I think she's going to try to reconnect. And I did also have a question for her and Jordan in a moment. I don't see her back on yet. Okay, I'm going to ask Jordan my question while we're waiting to see if Maddie can reconnect. So Jordan, when you were talking about 70,000 oysters, I was curious, do they eat from the surrounding waters the whole time, or do you have to supplement with certain special feed for them as they grow?
So all oysters grown outside of the hatchery, or at least in Maine, are grown just with the natural plankton that's in the water. So there's no external feeding. The only crop I feed, and I feed them macroalgae that I grow on the farm, are green sea urchins. But that's the only crop like that, unless you're farming finfish.
Okay, thank you. And Madison, welcome back. And you're welcome to share what you were talking about before. If you could possibly start it again, that would be helpful. And then if it cuts out, maybe try it without video.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. Island Wi-Fi can be a little spotty sometimes. So we were talking about what we were doing about changing waters. And so what I was mentioning is that one thing that Hurricane is doing is as much monitoring as we can. And so that's, taking temperature data around the island, monitoring larval settlement of our scallops, taking sort of more in-depth measurements of our site to figure out what the pH is, what the salinity is, what our currents are doing, all of that. And so some of this is really specific sort of for about our site and around our island. But they're also sort of monitoring projects that we're doing where the data sort of doesn't exist for the area we're in. So, for example, the reproduction studies that we were doing that I was talking about in the beginning with our dissections, that data doesn't really exist around Penn Bay. And so across all of these things, things have already changed, but it's still really important to us that we sort of understand what they are now, because we can't necessarily figure out what they were in the past. But as we move into the future, at least we'll be sort of have some sort of baseline, even though it's already shifted. So thank you for bringing it back to me.
No problem. I'm glad you got to hop back on and share that. So it's good to hear that there are solutions and that they're being done currently so we can move forward and have successes in the future. So I want to say thank you so much to all of our speakers for spending time with us this evening, and to all of the audience members for joining us. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, all the presenters. And thank you for sharing about the amazing shellfish industry. And this is a quick reminder that if you enjoyed tonight's presentation, please consider leaving a donation. And I will put, that link is already in the chat. Okay, and we hope to see you at next month's Learn, Discover, Grow event. It will be on Tuesday, June 28th at 7 p.m. The event will be on shell middens, ancient shellfish use by Maine's native cultures. Our speakers will be Sarah Gladu, Director of Education and Citizen Science at Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust, and Dr. Bonnie Newsom, Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Associate Faculty in the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine. So I hope you all had a good time here tonight, and we hope to see you at the next event. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you.